A broader perspective now from Karabekir Akkoyunlu. He was born and raised in Turkey and is now an assistant professor of modern Turkey at the Center of Southeast European Studies at the University of Graz in Austria. That's where we reached him. Mr. Akkoyunlu, how would you describe the changes that we're seeing in Turkey now?
Well, I would go back in time a little bit. Over the course of the past decade, but especially since the beginning of the Arab Spring uprisings, Turkish politics has been operating in an atmosphere of increasingly vicious power struggles over the reins of the state, where key political actors, be they the party of President Recep Tayyip Erdogan or his former allies, the Gülen movement, or parts of the Turkish military, are motivated by a sort of dominate or die mentality. Now, there are two immediate casualties to this type of zero-sum politics and existential insecurity. One of them is the type of dialogue and compromise which are essential for a functioning democracy. And the second is rule of law. And that impacts everything. For quite some time, for instance, Turkey has not had a foreign policy that is based on any principled long-term strategic thinking or planning. Turkish foreign policy is simply an extension of the government's domestic policy. And the government, by which I mean really just President Erdogan now, has one and only one policy, and that is ensuring his political and personal survival and complete domination over Turkey's state institutions. In the most immediate future, this means enabling and passing a series of constitutional changes which Turkey will go to a referendum to vote in a couple of weeks on the 16th of April. But in general, this type of politics calls for an extremely, in fact, brutally pragmatic short-term thinking where, close friends can become bitter enemies and old enemies can become new friends almost overnight. So this goes both for in internal politics of Turkey and its foreign relations, where you see the West being an enemy overnight, where Russia goes from an enemy to becoming a friend. Same goes for Israel, for President Assad of Syria, and so on and so forth.
What do you think will happen in that referendum?
I don't know. It looks like it's very much on balance right now, so it's difficult to say what will happen. But if the referendum passes, what will happen is that the existing political status quo will be effectively recognized and constitutionally and legally consolidated. So the current constitution requires the president of the country to be a non-partisan actor that is above the fray of everyday politics, but in practice, President Erdogan does not only actively engage in partisan politics, but he also effectively interferes with and almost dominates all other branches of power. If the referendum passes, Turkey will officially become a one-man state where the existing political status quo will become constitutionalized. And that would put an end to the country's long experience of parliamentarism and parliamentary democracy, which goes back to the mid-19th century in the Ottoman Empire. What's less clear, however, is what would happen if the referendum doesn't pass. Because if the referendum and the no vote prevails in the referendum, the status quo as it exists will continue to prevail. But this is not a sustainable or even a desirable status quo for either the government or for the opposition, which means Turkey would once again enter a period of uncertainty and instability. And new questions would arise as to what the president of the country and what the government and the opposition would do after that.
I want to ask you a little bit about human rights, because we know, of course, that there have been dozens upon dozens of journalists who've been imprisoned in Turkey. And I understand that academics and scholars like yourself are being affected too. Tell me a little bit about that.
Right. Well, to put it in perspective, freedom of expression and academic freedoms have never really been fully secured in Turkey. Leftist scholars and intellectuals were targeted throughout the 70s and the 80s. Islamists and Kurds throughout the 1990s. But what's happening today, where academia and critical academics come under direct and scathing attack, both by the president personally and by institutions of the state, is particularly worrying and unique in a sense for two main reasons. First, because it comes after a brief but very important period of relative openness that started in the 2000s, where an emboldened and self-confident civil society and academia managed to publicly address and engage in discussions about some of Turkey's most pressing social, political, cultural, historical issues that were previously untouched. And now, all of a sudden, that space has closed down once again. And secondly, and in conjunction with that, the existing state of uncertainty and lack of rule of law, especially under the state of emergency laws that have been passed since last summer's coup attempt, means that activities and even benign activities such as signing a petition that are constitutionally protected and would have been considered normal only a couple of years ago could now be considered a criminal activity tantamount to supporting terrorism. And in fact, this is what's happening to a group of academics, around 2,000 academics who are called the Academics of Peace, who signed a petition in early 2016 condemning the government's policies in the Kurdish regions, and have since become the target of persecution legally and politically by the government. So what it means is that not only are the current legal boundaries uncertain, but there's also a risk that past activities can be retrospectively criminalized, which goes directly against the basic principle of rule of law and democracy in Turkey, and that's why it's particularly worrisome what's happening now.
As you look at it, and based on your own research and expertise, what is your best and perhaps most realistic hope for Turkey now?
Well, I guess we need to understand that Turkey is going through a particularly extreme case of democratic backsliding, but it's not a unique case. It's not an island in an ocean. It is very much connected to, and what's happening in Turkey is very much integral to what's happening elsewhere in the wider region and in fact around the world. That is something that we need to understand in Turkey and outside of Turkey. I think in the long run, where I would want to put my hope on would be a wider understanding of the fact that what happens in the Western world, in Canada, the United States, Western Europe, is very much connected to what happens in Turkey, and Turkey is connected to Syria, Egypt, Iran, Afghanistan, so on and so forth. We're all on the same boat and it's sinking. Therefore, it's necessary to open up perspectives and visions rather than erecting walls. But I'm very much aware that this is a long-term hope, and things will get worse before they get better, especially for Turkey. So in that knowledge and in that realization, I feel that the most realistic hope and the most pragmatic action would be to create areas of international solidarity and zones of breathing space for Turkey's persecuted academics and intellectuals who carry a very important legacy, important intellectual capital and memory. This should be preserved so that when things get slightly better, these people can go back and continue their work in Turkey, and not everything that has been gained over the last decade is lost forever.
Mr. Akkoyunlu, thank you very much for your perspective and your expertise on this.
Thank you for having me.